If you've ever felt older than your actual age, not physically, but internally, this might explain something. Maybe you've always felt slightly out of place around people your age. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you participate. You've been called mature your whole life, responsible, calm, wise for your age. And while it sounds like a compliment, it also feels strangely isolating. Because internally, it doesn't always feel like maturity. Sometimes it just feels like you had to grow up faster than everyone else. People who feel older than their age often carry a certain emotional weight that others don't immediately see. They think carefully before they speak. They rarely react impulsively. They anticipate consequences before making decisions. From the outside, this looks like emotional control, but internally, it often comes from something deeper. A system that learned early on that emotional mistakes had real consequences. So instead of learning through chaos, they learned through observation. Instead of experimenting freely, they learned through caution. Not because they wanted to, but because it felt safer. You might notice how you've always been more comfortable with older people. Their conversations feel easier, more predictable, less emotionally demanding, while interactions with people your own age sometimes feel overstimulating or shallow or misaligned. It's not arrogance, it's familiarity. Because internally, your emotional world developed earlier. You processed things sooner. You understood emotional complexity before most people around you did. And once you see the world through that lens, it's hard to go back. This pattern often begins in environments where emotional stability wasn't guaranteed, where you had to read the room carefully, where you had to notice subtle emotional shifts, where being emotionally aware wasn't optional, it was necessary. You learn to detect tension. You learn to adjust your behavior accordingly. You learn to regulate yourself even when no one taught you how. And over time, that awareness became part of who you are. Not something you try to do, something you automatically are. You may also notice how independent you've always been emotionally. You rarely rely on others for comfort. You process things internally. You rarely show the full extent of what you feel. Not because you don't feel deeply, but because you learned early that emotional self-reliance was more predictable than emotional dependence. Depending on others introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't feel safe to a system that learned to stabilize itself alone. So you became your own emotional anchor. And here's where it gets interesting. Feeling older than your age isn't always about intelligence. It's often about adaptation. When someone experiences emotional unpredictability early in life, their nervous system accelerates certain forms of development. Not physical development, not intellectual development, emotional development. They become more aware, more observant, more internally structured because their environment required it. This isn't something they consciously chose. It's something their system learned to survive. This is why people who feel older than their age often struggle to fully relax. Even in calm situations, part of them remains alert, observing, monitoring, not anxiously, but habitually. Their nervous system is used to scanning for emotional consistency. It's used to preparing for shifts. It's used to maintaining internal stability regardless of external conditions. Relaxation feels unfamiliar, not because they can't relax, but because their baseline has always been awareness. You may also notice how early you've become comfortable being alone. Not necessarily because you preferred isolation, but because solitude felt emotionally simpler, more predictable, less emotionally demanding. When you're alone, there are fewer emotional variables, fewer unknown reactions, fewer uncertainties. Solitude becomes a place where your system can exist without adjusting itself for others, and that feels calm. There's also a subtle emotional restraint that develops. You don't express everything you feel. You filter. You process internally first. You consider the impact of your emotions on others before showing them. Not because you're hiding, but because emotional responsibility became part of your identity early on. You learn to carry your emotions carefully. You learn to contain them. You learn to manage them privately. Over time, this creates a certain emotional distance between you and others. Not because you don't want connection, but because your internal world developed in a space where you had to rely on yourself. You became familiar with self-containment, self-regulation, self-observation. And while others were learning emotional dependence, you were learning emotional independence. This doesn't make you disconnected, it makes you internally structured. People who feel older than their age also tend to think long term naturally. They consider outcomes, they anticipate emotional consequences. They don't just react to the present moment, they mentally simulate the future because their system learned early on that foresight creates safety, predictability creates stability, and stability creates emotional security. But the real reason people feel older than their age isn't always visible from the outside. It's not about acting older, it's about adapting earlier. It's about carrying emotional awareness sooner than expected. It's about learning emotional self-reliance before it was developmentally necessary. It's about becoming internally structured in response to external unpredictability. This isn't something that happens randomly. It happens through repetition, through subtle emotional learning, through experience. And over time, this becomes identity. You become the calm one, the responsible one, the understanding one, the one others rely on, not because you forced yourself into that role, but because your system naturally operates from stability, even when things around you aren't stable. But beneath that stability is something most people don't see: adaptation. A nervous system that learned to prioritize awareness, to prioritize emotional safety, to prioritize internal control, not as a preference, but as protection, and that protection becomes personality. When you see it this way, feeling older than your age isn't the personality flaw, it's a developmental pattern. A pattern shaped by emotional experience, a pattern shaped by early awareness, a pattern shaped by adaptation. You didn't randomly become this way, your system learned it, gradually, quietly, automatically. And once that pattern forms, it becomes your normal. You don't notice how much you observe. You don't notice how much you regulate yourself. You don't notice how much emotional weight you carry internally, because it feels natural to you. It feels like who you are. But when you step back and look at it clearly, something becomes obvious. You didn't just grow older, parts of you grew faster. Parts of you adapted sooner. Parts of you learned stability before stability was guaranteed. And that changes how you move through the world. Quietly, internally, consistently. Once you recognize this pattern, it reframes something important. You're not older than your age by accident. You're older in the ways your system needed to be. Emotionally, internally, structurally. It was never random. It was a pattern. And once you see that pattern, you begin to understand yourself in a deeper way. If this explains something you've quietly felt for a long time, there's always more beneath the surface to explore. Because sometimes the parts of you that matured early were simply the parts trying to keep you safe.